marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. We give them a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home.
In late 1864 and early 1865, as the Union armies were marching across the panhandle of Florida, culminating in the Battle of Natural Bridge, Confederate forces built this very tiny fortification on the south side of the city. This is Old Fort Park, also known as Fort Houston, which was on the Houston plantation, built to defend the city. It never happened, of course. Tallahassee fell, but not because of armies, because of the end of the war. I'm Bob Holliday, president of the Tallahassee Historical Society, and with me is Kevin Bair. Kevin has been a member of the Historical Society for several years now. He's getting his PhD from Liberty University. And we're standing here because we thought this would be a good place to talk about his May 11th talk to the Tallahassee Historical Society at our annual business meeting at Mission San Luis. Kevin's going to be talking about Civil War medicine. And Kevin, welcome.
Thank you.
And let's get right. Why are you so interested in Civil War medicine?
Well, that's an interesting story. I have not always been a historian. I have a background in electronic engineering, which I did for years. But I had an injury years ago in the Navy, and it slowly has morphed into more and more problems. And to this day, I have found, because of the injury, I got injured I worked on jets, electronics, and aircraft carriers, and I fell off the flight deck into a steel catwalk and messed up my spine. But so I go do a lot of time at the VA hospitals in Gainesville. And while down there, I happen to, I see all these veterans coming back from Afghanistan and even Vietnam who, limbs missing and whatnot. So I started thinking about how was medical care in other eras, before this era of really good medicine, which got me thinking about Civil War medicine. So during this time, I was in my graduate school at Johns Hopkins University, and I was studying medicine just because it's part of the curriculum there. And while there, I took a class on public health, social medicine, and World War I medicine. That led me into what we're at today, doing Civil War medicine. I just kind of morphed through and found my area that I found interesting, and I started reflecting more on soldiers' injuries and got into the Civil War just by chance. And I found it really interesting, so now I'm finally going to do my dissertation on it.
One of the, I've always been kind of very interested in the Civil War and Civil War photography in particular, and one of the most gruesome Civil War photographs that I have ever seen was a photograph, I think, taken on the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam, where there were it's the pictures, just piles of amputated arms and legs. And, we're talking about an era, no antibiotics, very crude, if no knowledge of germs and so forth, where if you got shot, in the arm or the leg, the chances were very high that you were going to lose that arm or leg. And if you got shot anywhere else, in the gut,
you don't want to get shot in the gut. No.
Right. You're not.
That's not good.
Yeah, you're not going to make it.
No.
So
So my dissertation actually is on the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, or most people know it as the Battle of Shiloh, April 6th and 7th of 1862. And during that battle on the Tennessee River, the civilians up in St. Louis were alarmed at the number of casualties that were telegraphed back up to St. Louis. And so they civilian groups sent down ships to take care of the wounded, to get them off the battlefield. Now, this goes back to why did they do that in the first place? Well, that goes back to the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale, which is in the 1850s. Florence Nightingale had a big impact on this country and how we take care of sanitation in general. So we had a big movement in the 1850s through the 1860s of sanitation committees. We had conferences,
Yeah.
3 or 4 big ones where the big cities would get together. They have a conference in the big city to do medicine, to figure out how to make better health. So we were on the verge of having very good public medicine knowledge, and then a war hit and put us backwards. There were a number of outstanding universities, medical schools in this country before the war. And many people went to it, but not all. Of course, you had to be wealthy and pretty much elitist to go to a university back then, right? So a lot of the doctors, the Civil War doctors, learned by apprenticeship from other doctors they learned from. So they were not educated as far as a typical degree goes. And so that made a conflict between the regular academic doctors and the country doctors.
Yeah.
There was a conflict going on
Yeah.
there. So not only did we have poor medical care at the time, we also had a conflict between theories. We had a more educated, modern theory of how medicine should be, and we had an older school, based on the 1830s, 1840s era education of the doctors' training.
Were we still bleeding people?
Yes, we
at the time
still
of the
were.
Civil War?
In fact, some of my magazines, articles, I see you can get the best leeches.
Yeah.
Buy Joe's best leeches because they do it the best.
They do it the best.
Yeah, So that's what we're talking about. But back to St. Louis, or back to the Pittsburgh Landing. So we had this convolution of emotions. We had doctors who were educated and doctors who were country. We had the society was all upset about, they remember the Crimean War. It was all in the newspapers and Florence Nightingale. So when the war broke out, there were sanitary commissions already in place, and they started to get bandages and get things together for the war. We had women's aid societies.
Right.
We had several societies, knitting societies, crochet society. Everybody's getting stuff together for the war. So when the Pittsburgh Landing happened, and they telegraphed off to the other places, different area cities where there were where they needed supplies, they rushed down here. Now, a battle of Pittsburgh Landing was 100,000 men, both Confederates and Yankees, 100,000, and over 16,000 were actually wounded. That's not counting dead. That's 16,000 wounded. So my dissertation asks, who was ready? Or was the Army ready for 16,000 men in 2 days?
Yeah.
How do you have medical care? Well, in doing my research, I find out the Federal Army, they required, because they were behind getting to the battlefield, made the troops leave their medical supplies behind, leave tents behind. They left food wagons behind to march to the battle. So they had the battle. Now they're short of medical supplies.
Oh, boy.
What do? We don't even have tents. These guys are out there laying in the fields for 2-3 days a week with no tents after being wounded. So what happened is an organization called the Western Sanitary Commission out of St. Louis, they sent down ships for medical care. And that's what we started. That's what my dissertation is talking about. I have 2 federal doctors who said, I will not send my troops, my wounded, on those ships because those ships are contaminated, they're stinky, they're filthy, there will just be, there's more illness on that ship than there is on the battlefield, right? Well, yet the ships come down with doctors and nurses, and the nurses were nuns, a Sisters of Charity, came down from St. Louis. They came down with apothecaries and medicine, ready to go. But the battlefield got doctors that say, no, we are better. So there's a conflict there between who had a better idea.
The Civil War, I mean, the casualty figures keep going up. The last figure I saw about the number of dead was well over 700,000. How many of those do you estimate came from the more primitive medical conditions?
Well, that was part of the problem. Is the battles happened so fast, and the medical care was set based on Napoleon type of war, Napoleonic war battlefield, right? So we weren't prepared. The doctors weren't prepared.
Right.
So of course it was crude because they couldn't get the supplies, they couldn't get the medicine. A lot of them died just because of bad amputations.
Right.
Right? Or bad suturing, infections, because they didn't know anything about infections. So one of the nurses on the hospital ship said that when she walked on deck, first of all, it was very slippery because of blood everywhere. But in the stern or the back of the ship was just piles of limbs.
Yeah.
And the other report has of doctors, take the limbs off, they throw them in the water, going down the river off the hospital ships, right? Because they got to do something with them.
Yeah.
This is not counting what happened on shore at the battlefield medicine, right? The same things are going on over there. So they were in a panic. They had to work fast, and they were understaffed, of course. And in the hospital ships, they weren't hospital ships yet. They're medical transports, and these are field transports. These are barges being towed. When I say transports, you had cows on it and horses on it, and you had guys laying down next to them who were wounded, going back up someplace, and so it was not a very sanitary at all. That's how this happened. So the talk on in May at the festival or at your meeting will be go over all that, but I won't go into the gory stuff like people are eating.
Right. Well, Florida, I mean, it is worth noting that there are lots of ways that Florida was lucky in the Civil War. One of them is that there were only 2 battles of any size, and you compare even certainly Natural Bridge or even Olustee to what takes place at Shiloh.
Right.
And it's nothing, to be quite honest.
Well, but when you're an injured soldier, you're wounded, it doesn't make a difference if you've got 100,000 guys being wounded or you got 10 wounded. If you have one doctor for 1,000 guys,
right,
it doesn't make a difference.
Right.
If you have 100 people at Natural Bridge, for instance, I don't know their actual numbers there, but say 100 people, and 25 got wounded, but you had one doctor, one on the Confederacy, and maybe none of them came up with a union. I don't know, but it's the odds are against the soldier. They're wounded, no matter where you're at. The first paper I ever wrote on the Civil War medicine was on the Battle of Manassas, July 21st, 1861, and that ended up being published at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine.
Right.
So that one goes into the chaos at Manassas, right? They had all these, and they had zero medical care to speak of there.
Right.
Because it was the first war that had to be done in a couple of days, actually, or a day, and one side's going to whip the other, and they're all going to go home. And they never really thought about the outcome of the war. Yeah. And Shiloh became a crying, national cry for better medical care. So when Shiloh happened 6 months later, there was already nervousness. The thing about Shiloh, and people don't pay attention, is Shiloh's way over in the Western Theater on the Tennessee River, away from the eyes and the press of the East Coast. Right. So it became a footnote, really, in the Civil War history. But then more and more people spent time on the Peninsula Campaign, which was going on at the same time. And Island Number 10 battle went on at the same time. So all these things kind of overshadowed. But then about 9 months later, you had Antietam, which is still the bloodiest single day in American history. And everybody wakes up and pays attention. They do. Everybody wakes up and pays attention to that. Probably the single most accurate scene in the movie Gone with the Wind is in that hospital in Atlanta where they're amputating the soldier's leg and he's screaming, and Scarlett says, "I'm not putting up with it is one of the folklores, I guess you'd say, or myths, is that the guys had to bite on bullets or wood or something, right? Well, majority of the amputation, they had either ether or chloroform. They truly did. Right. But not everywhere. So there were some guys that had to do it without, but they did have it and they did administer it. So the question is, though, while you're trying to put this guy to sleep, these other guys are bleeding to death out here. I mean, so you gotta, how do you choose? I mean, so we had that, and the science for medicine was really good. I mean, it wasn't terrible. I mean, we can't look at it as from today. We got to look at it from that period. Right. And there were some really educated people. They knew a lot of stuff. They didn't know germ theory, but they knew there were things that caused, what certain things caused illness. Certain things made a wound worse. They just couldn't name it, Right. But the rural doctors, the country doctors, didn't know all this yet, And by the time the war got done, the professional doctors up in Washington and other areas were actually taking pictures of incisions and wounds and how you'd stitch things up and publishing them out in books. Right? They were putting books out to doctors in the field. Okay, if you have something that looks like this is how you fix it. This is how you suture it. This is how you go in and what you got to do for it. But they were actually putting manuals out during that towards the end of the war to help this out, pictures and everything. Right. So all these things really took place in the war. It was not a backwoods where we don't know what the heck we're doing surgeries anymore. I mean, right. They had people who knew what they were doing. It was time crunch. How do you save all this time? Because most of the surgeons never, or we call them surgeons, right? They're doctors. Most of them, 99% of them, have never even did a surgery up until the Civil War. Yeah. Okay, there were specialists who did surgeries back in the public sector, but not everyday doctors, because one of the things, you could not have a cadaver in a medical school. There was religious reasons. You could not just go get Joe out of the cemetery or the morgue. So we had grave robbers, and it was true. We had grave robbers taking people, bringing them, and we were doing things kind of illegally on the side of schools. The other thing is there were for-profit schools, for-profit medical schools during this time. And for-profit medical schools where, hey, you come to 5 lectures, we'll give you a certificate of being a doctor.
I see.
So that was going on. So when the war started, there was a long, slow process to weed out who's a good surgeon and a bad surgeon. We had a board of, medical directors for the Federal Army who did that. Now and they found out who was good and bad and weeded it out. The other thing about the Civil War is we had the Federal Army, and the Confederates were the same thing. They had a main small army, but they had volunteer regiments from each state. And a lot of people don't understand this, that each state had to supply their own men, their own equipment, their own medicine, their own ambulances.
Yeah.
So if I'm from Illinois, and I'm sent down to Shiloh, and my men get slaughtered or really injured terribly. Slaughter's not a tough word, but they're terribly wounded. But my medical wagon gets destroyed or stolen from the Confederacy. I have to telegraph back to Illinois governor to get more medical supplies. So the Federals did the state regiments did their state regiments. We weren't combined yet in 1862 to make it really a smooth running operation. And the Florida 1st Regiment was at the Battle of Shiloh.
Oh.
Yes, they were.
Okay.
So, and I'll be talking about them at our meeting in May.
Oh, this is good.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a great talk. Again, if you're interested in the Civil War, if you're interested in medicine and the progress that medicine has made, you should come out on May the 11th to Mission San Luis. It is our potluck. It is our potluck picnic, the last meeting of the year for us, and so the Historical Society will provide the barbecue. Everybody else brings desserts and salads or whatever. We'll conduct a little business at the meeting. We'll elect a new board of directors, and we'll get a few reports on membership and finances and so forth. And then we'll turn it over to Kevin, and this should be a really, really interesting talk. So, Kevin, looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
This is going to be great.
Awesome.
Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. We give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. The old church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah. To welcome home our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lasses, they with roses, they will strew the way, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Get ready for the jubilee, hurrah, hurrah. We give the hero 3 times 3, hurrah, hurrah. The laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his loyal brow, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Let love and friendship on that day, hurrah, hurrah. Their choicest treasures then display, hurrah,